There is information that several media have been repeating for days about Julián Álvarez and his teammates at Atlético de Madrid. It is completely false, and what happened last night at a restaurant in the center of Madrid denies it with an image that is worth much more than any official statement. Almost the entire red and white squad having dinner with Julián until the early hours of the morning, behind Simeone and the technical staff of Atlético, with a plan about that table that no one had seen before in Spanish football to help him get out of Atlético de Madrid at once. Stay, because we are going to tell you everything before anyone else. There are people inside Atlético who do not know that this dinner happened. Simeone does not know that his own players gathered behind him to help Julián get out of the club, and when he discovers it, the reaction will be devastating. Like and subscribe so you don't miss any of this. The narrative that several media have been repeating these last few days is that Atlético de Madrid's locker room is completely fed up with Julián Álvarez and everything he is generating. That his teammates are deeply uncomfortable with the tense situation that is being experienced within the club. That the squad no longer supports his intention to leave. That the conflict between Julián and Atlético has ended by generating a real distancing within the locker room, which makes his departure even more complicated before the closure of the market. That version is completely false. What happened last night at a restaurant in the center of Madrid denies that narrative in such a clear and forceful way that it does not need any additional explanation of any kind. Julián Álvarez spoke one-on-one with each teammate of Atlético during the whole day yesterday, in a personal way. He called them on the phone, looked for them in the corridors of Cerro del Espino before and after training, wrote them direct messages and invited them to dinner that same night at a restaurant in the center of the Madrid capital. The vast majority of the squad accepted it without hesitation. That alone already says something very important about the real state of the relationship between Julián and his teammates within the Atlético de Madrid locker room. A player of whom they are supposedly fed up, according to various media. A locker room that is supposedly very uncomfortable with him and with everything that this summer has generated. And yet, when Julián invited them to dinner in a totally spontaneous way, almost the entire squad showed up at that restaurant, behind Simeone's back, without telling anyone outside of that closed group of players. Julián asked them not to say anything before dinner that meeting had been held, that everything that was said inside that restaurant would remain between them and only between them. And the squad of Atlético de Madrid respected that request for privacy throughout the night, until this channel met him and decided to tell him. To understand what that dinner meant, you have to understand at what exact point Julián was when he organized it so spontaneously. He had spent weeks being the most media protagonist of Spanish football in recent years. He had done things that no footballer had done before in a signing process. He had taken his case to FIFA. He had appeared with the BARÇA shirt in the parking lot of Cerro del Espino. He had seen Simeone throw him out of the locker room screaming in front of the whole team. He had received the employment and salary suspension with 3 demolition conditions designed by El Cholo personally. He had been snitched on by his own fans in the metropolitan Guanda. And on top of all that, the media said that his own teammates were fed up with him. That was the moment when Julián decided that he needed to do something completely different from everything he had done so far in this club. Something that wasn't a public statement in front of the cameras. Something that wasn't a legal move against FIFA or the courts. Something more human than all that. More direct, more real and closer. A dinner with his teammates. What happened inside that restaurant in the center of Madrid that night is the most human and unexpected thing about this long and exhausting summer of Spanish football. Julián sat down with his teammates around that table. The same ones that have been watching from the inside with their own eyes how the situation deteriorates more and more inside the club. The same ones that several media outlets have been saying for days that they are completely fed up with him and everything that he is generating. And the first thing Julián did when everyone was sitting down and the conversation began was to ask them for forgiveness in a sincere way. He asked them for forgiveness for the decision he had made to leave Atlético this summer. For the long, intense process that decision had generated inside the locker room and inside the club during all these weeks. He told them that if any of the teammates present at that table had felt offended or bothered by his behavior during this convulsive summer, he wanted them to know that he really felt it and that it had never been his intention. That gesture of asking for forgiveness is very important precisely because he does it in private and without external witnesses. In a dinner where there are no television cameras or radio microphones or anyone in the world of football who is going to know unless they themselves tell him later. That kind of sincere gesture is not done by someone who is facing his locker room or someone to whom his teammates have turned their backs. It is done by someone who deeply respects his teammates even if he has made a decision that has complicated the summer for everyone. After the forgiveness came the hardest and most unexpected confession of the whole night. A confession that none of the players who were sitting at that table expected to hear at any time of that dinner. And that when they heard it, it changed something inside all of them in a way that no public statement could have ever generated. Julián also told them about the real origin of his decision to want to leave Atlético, something that he had never publicly explained with that clarity. He confessed that he made the decision last season after being replaced in a key match of the Champions League at the time, when the team needed him the most on the pitch. That moment was the one that made him understand that his path in Atlético had reached a point of inflection from which he could no longer go back, that he needed a change of course, that change had the name of FC Barcelona, and that since then everything he has done this summer has been a direct consequence of that decision taken in silence after that Champions League match that changed everything in his head. Julián told them that after each training session at Cerro del Espino, he goes to psychological therapy to be able to manage what he is experiencing. That mentally he is at a limit that he had never reached in any moment of his professional sporting career. That the decision of Atlético and Simeone not to let him leave is having an impact on his mental well-being that goes far beyond purely sporting. That there are days when getting to Cerro del Espino and putting on the club shirt and training with teammates who know perfectly well that he wants to leave has become something that he alone cannot continue to endure indefinitely. That confession about psychological therapy was exactly what changed the tone of the whole dinner immediately. Because until that specific moment his teammates knew that Julián wanted to leave Atlético. They knew that the situation was complicated and tense for everyone. But hearing from his own mouth and in person that he is going to psychological therapy after each training session, that mentally he is reaching a serious limit that needs real help from the people around him, that changed something deep inside that restaurant that none of the players present expected to feel when they arrived that night to have dinner with him. What Julián asked them next and the idea that Cuti Romero put on that table is what we tell now in the next part. Julián asked them for help directly and without beating around the bush. He told them that he had been trying for weeks to force his departure from Atlético de Madrid by all possible means and that nothing had worked at all until that moment. That he had exhausted the institutional avenues like FIFA. That he had exhausted the avenues of public pressure with the provocations to Simeone. That he had exhausted the threats and the calculated gestures in the parking lot and in the locker room. And that now he needed something completely different from all that. He needed them, who knew Simeone better than anyone else in the world, to give him concrete ideas about how to get El Cholo to finally put him away from the team in a definitive and irrevocable way. Because if Simeone put him away definitively, Atlético would have to sell him. And if Atlético sold him, BARÇA was waiting for him with the offer ready. The table remained silent for a few long seconds while the players processed what Julián had just asked them. And then the ideas began one after the other. His teammates proposed everything during the first minutes of that part of the conversation. That he would miss training in a systematic and reiterated way. That when Simeone gave him a tactical order inside the field, he would ignore it in front of the whole team and the bench. That if he was summoned for an official match in an unexpected way, he simply would not appear in the team's concentration without giving any public explanation. That he would arrive late to the training sessions of the Cerro del Espino in a reiterated and deliberate way until the coaching staff had no choice but to act formally and officially. Julián listened carefully to each proposal. He took a mental note of everything his teammates put on the table. But none of those ideas completely convinced him or made him sure that it would work in a definitive way. Because they all had a very similar problem deep down. They were measures that Atlético Madrid could manage internally with their usual mechanisms without generating the type of external and irresistible pressure that Julián needed to force a real and urgent negotiation with BARÇA before the closure of the market. Then, Cuti Romero took the floor in that Madrid restaurant and the table was completely silent to listen to him. Cuti Romero has been at Atlético Madrid since the summer from Tottenham Hotspur with a 5-year contract. But before arriving at Atlético Madrid, Cuti has known Diego Pablo Simeone for many years. He knows him as the coach of the Argentine team with which he has worked in the greatest competition in the world. He knows him as the man who has forged his career and that of a whole generation of elite Argentine footballers. And he knows him in a deep and specific way that no European player can ever know him. From within the culture of Argentine football, from the same way of understanding competition and sacrifice, from the same emotional language that only footballers trained in that culture of South American football share. Therefore, what Cuti proposed that night in that restaurant in the center of Madrid was completely different in its nature from everything that the other teammates had put on the table during the first minutes of conversation. Cuti told Julián to stop trying to provoke Simeone from outside the pitch and from outside the daily work. That this did not work because El Cholo has been at Atlético for 15 years enduring external pressures of all kinds and has a management capacity of those pressures that very few coaches in the world match. That the only way to really force Simeone to make a decision he does not want to make was to affect him in the only thing that El Cholo cannot control from the bench without acting immediately and forcefully. The results of the team on the pitch. The plan that Cuti proposed is the following, and no one at that dinner had imagined it before Cuti said it. Julián continues to go to training with total apparent normality. He continues to behave like a professional within the facilities of Cerro del Espino. He continues to let himself be called up for matches when Simeone considers it appropriate. He continues to fulfill all the contractual obligations that Atlético can demand of him. He does not generate any visible or documentable conflict that Atlético can use as an argument to further harden their stance against him. But when Simeone decides to take him off the pitch in an official match, everything changes radically and immediately. The moment Julián steps on the grass in an official match, everything changes in a subtle and calculated way. He has to get a goal against Atlético in a sufficiently calculated way, but in a rather hidden way so that Simeone cannot point directly at him as the only responsible. A bad pass at the most inopportune moment. A move that leaves a teammate in a compromised position in front of the rival. A ball loss in a very dangerous area of the field that the opposing team can take advantage of quickly. Nothing so shameless and obvious that Simeone can point directly at him in the dressing room, but enough effective and shocking so that the final result of the match is clearly affected every time Julián appears on the pitch. That generates a situation that Simeone simply cannot ignore for a long time without having serious consequences for him as a coach. If Atlético's results are consistently harmed every time Julián enters the pitch in the final minutes, the club's board will inevitably start pressuring Simeone because Atlético's board is not willing to sacrifice important results in La Liga and Champions for maintaining a war of ego and power with a player who wants to leave and who has already shown that he is willing to do everything. And when that pressure from the board finally reaches the coach, Simeone will have to choose between two options that are equally bad for him: continue to call Julián for the matches and continue to see how the results of the team suffer visibly every time the player enters the pitch in the final minutes, or stop calling him and definitely separate him from the first team. And if he separates him definitively, the negotiation with BARÇA opens up immediately because Atlético can no longer argue in front of anyone that Julián is part of their sporting plans for the season. Julián listened to Cuti's plan in total silence during all the time that the Argentinian midfielder took to explain it with all his important details. When Cuti finished explaining it completely, Julián felt slow several times in a row. That was exactly the idea that had been missing in all the previous weeks of this exhausting scuffle. A provocation that was neither visible nor documentable directly by Atlético, a confrontation that was neither frontal nor explicit and that could not be used against him. Something much more subtle and much smarter than everything he had tried so far with Simeone. Something that would directly affect the only thing that really matters within any professional football club of the first world level: the 3 points of each official match and the final classification of the club that determines the prestige. The players who were sitting at that table in the restaurant in the center of Madrid also reacted to Cuti's proposal. The proposal seemed the boldest, the most ingenious, and the most effective of all those that had been put on that table throughout that night. And several of them told Julián that he would count on them for what he needed inside the field in the next games if the plan was finally executed in the way that Cuti had described so clearly that night. What happened at the end of that dinner at high hours in the early morning in that restaurant in the center of Madrid, and what that concrete and revealing detail says about the real and true relationship between Julián and the dressing room of Atlético de Madrid, is exactly what we tell now in the last part of this exclusive story that this channel knows before anyone else. The dinner ended at high hours in the early morning of that Sunday in that restaurant in the center of Madrid. The workers who attended that night to the squad of Atlético de Madrid described what they experienced as something they had not seen before in that place or in many others. A large group of young men who arrived serious and with the weight of the situation above, and that as the night progressed they were opening something that at the beginning of the night seemed completely closed and tense. A table where there was something much more than food and conversation about the table, where there was something very similar to the genuine solidarity of a group of people who share a difficult situation and who have decided not to look elsewhere. The last person to leave the restaurant when the night was already early was Julián Álvarez. He quietly stayed when the rest left little by little during the last minutes of the night. He spoke with the last companions who were still in the place, and before leaving, he did something that none of the players present expected him to do when they arrived at that dinner that night. He paid the entire bill of all those who had been present that night. Of all the squad that had come to that night to that restaurant in the center of Madrid to listen to him and help him. An economic and symbolic gesture at the same time that the restaurant workers noticed and commented between them with surprise, and that it was like the clearest and most human symbol of everything that had happened in those long hours of dawn in that place in the center of Madrid. That is not done by someone whose companions are fed up with him and everything he generates. It is done by someone who feels genuinely indebted to the people who came when he really needed them, who wants to thank them in the only possible way that they were there that night so important to him, who knows perfectly well that what happened in that restaurant was something that no one had any obligation to do and that, however, almost the entire squad chose to do voluntarily and freely. There is something about the end of that dinner that deserves to be said clearly before closing this story, because there was a specific moment near the end of the night in which the tone of the entire conversation changed naturally and unexpectedly. The plans and football strategies were completely put aside for a few important minutes, and several of the players present told Julián something that, according to sources close to that dinner, affected him much more than any brilliant tactical idea that had been put on the table throughout the night. That they were going to miss him when he left. That they really hoped that everything would go well for him and his family. That BARÇA was a great club with a great sporting project this season, and that if there was someone in that dressing room who deserved to fulfill his sporting dream, that someone was him without a doubt. That turned that dinner into something that went much further than a simple strategic meeting of footballers looking for a practical solution to a specific problem. Turned it into a real farewell, although no one would call it that at the time. A discreet and completely private farewell between teammates who know deep down that they will probably be together for a very short time. That Coutinho's plan is going to work sooner or later, or that some other circumstance of the many that are underway will make Julián end up at BARÇA before the market closes this season. There is something about Coutinho's plan that deserves to be analyzed very calmly before it is executed in any game. Because the plan is smart and can be very effective, but it has a huge risk that Coutinho himself clearly pointed out that same night at the restaurant. If Julián does it in a too obvious way, if the goal against is too obvious for any observer, if anyone with a minimum level of football knowledge can see from the stands or from the bench that it has been completely deliberate, the consequence for Julián would be absolutely devastating for his career. Atlético Madrid could unilaterally terminate their contract for dishonest conduct, without paying anything. And in that scenario, Julián would not go to BARÇA. He would go directly to a legal and disciplinary process that could last for years. That is why Coutinho was very clear that night about how the plan has to be executed so that it really works, with a subtlety that is evident to no one at the time it happens. With the patience of an experienced player who knows that the results do not always arrive immediately. That it does not happen in the first game that Julián leaves the field, because that would make it too obvious for Simeone. That it does not happen in such a visible way that everyone inside and outside the stadium can easily connect the points. That it is something that gradually accumulates doubts in the mind of Simeone and the board over time. Not a bomb that explodes suddenly, but a constant pressure that grows very little by little until the club finally has to act with real consequences. That requires that Julián keeps a cool head, which at this point in the summer, so exhausting for him, is a lot to ask for, but which is absolutely essential for the plan to work. That he endures the pressure of executing it well, that he controls his impulses at the time of the game, that he executes the plan with the same coldness calculated with which he has executed each of the movements of this hummingbird during the last weeks. But Julián has shown during all these weeks of hummingbird that he has that coldness when he really needs it, that he can calculate each gesture in a very precise way, that he can withstand the most extreme public pressure without collapsing in front of the cameras, that he can plan in advance what he is going to do at each moment and execute it exactly as he thought without deviating from the original plan. What happens in the next official games of Atletico when Simeone decides to call Julián and get him out on the field is the biggest and most important mystery of all this hummingbird at this decisive moment. Because if Cuti's plan is executed correctly and with the necessary subtlety, the results of Atletico will begin to be gradually affected. Atletico's board is going to pressure Simeone directly to act urgently, and Cholo, finally, is going to have to make the only possible decision, the one that he has been refusing to make for weeks in the way that Julián needs it to happen. Meanwhile, the signing market continues to close day by day. Deco is waiting in Barcelona with the phone very close and with the offer ready. BARÇA is waiting with the offer prepared, and Julián finally has a concrete and well-designed plan that his own teammates created for him at that secret dinner. A plan that came out of a meeting that several media still do not know that took place last night in Madrid. A dinner that he himself paid for entirely to thank the teammates who came when he needed them the most in all this exhausting summer. And that, for someone who has been alone for weeks against a whole club, has a value that goes far beyond any tactical dimension. The farewell of that dinner was a long hug. Julián was hugging each teammate who was leaving to their cars in the early hours of Madrid. One by one, as Simeone does at the bus door before each game with the ritual that he has been maintaining for 15 years. Only that night in Madrid, the one who gave the hugs was Julián, and those who were leaving that restaurant towards the early hours of Madrid knew perfectly well that it was very likely that that hug was the last among them before the history of this very long summer of Spanish football would end one way or another and forever in the next few days. Subscribe and like because the plan is underway. And when Julián executes it, this channel tells you first.